Nanotechnology and material science can be termed as the most promising discipline, expanding the frontiers of the future of humanity. This discipline has seen exciting moments, unlocking possibilities for a new industrial wave, changing the future forever. Whether it is in drug delivery or in atmosphere science, the discipline is fast changing the world like never before. And today we have with us an eminent resource person who will take us to the topic nonlinear optics in the nano domain, materials and methods. He is currently the professor, Light and Matter Physics Group at Raman Research Institute, Bangalore, and has made many academic contributions to the world of physics. He has published numerous papers in international journals and also has 2 patents to his credit. He has acted as reviewer to several international journals from publishers like the American Institute of Physics, American Chemical Society, Optical Society of America, Royal Society of Chemistry, Elsevier, and also had held visiting scientist positions at the University of Massachusetts, University of Central Florida. I'm sure this will be an engaging session and will certainly provide great insights into the topic nonlinear optics in the nano domain, materials and methods. Sir, on behalf of the Postgraduate Department of Physics, St. Joseph's College for Women, I take this opportunity to welcome you to the National E-Conference. We are really honored with your esteemed presence. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much for that very generous and kind words of introduction. I'm very honored that I have this opportunity to be here today to talk to you a bit about nonlinear optics. And I thank Sister Marielli for inviting me to this conference to give this talk here. So the title of my talk is Nonlinear Optics in the Nano Domain, Materials and Methods. I am from the Raman Research Institute in Bangalore. The institute was founded by C.V. Raman in 1948, and the building that you see here is the building which was originally built under the supervision of Raman, and now there are a few more buildings in the campus. And this is our building actually. I belong to the Light and Matter Physics group. So this is our building. Actually, this board is right in front of my office. So people are discussing, and we have astronomy and astrophysics, soft condensed matter, theoretical physics, and light and matter physics departments. This is our canteen. And this telescope we had earlier in the campus, but now it is not there because our astronomy and astrophysics department works on radio galaxies and radio astronomy. So now they have moved to bigger telescopes, and they're also located away from Bangalore because there is a lot of EMI, electromagnetic interference, in Bangalore. So it's not very easy to run a telescope, a radio telescope in Bangalore anymore. So my talk is basically on nonlinear optics. We are all familiar with linear optics, the normal things that happen in everyday life. We need light to see everything, whatever around us. If it's very dark, then we cannot see anything. So light is very fundamental to our existence. But what we are normally used to is the linear domain of light-matter interaction. So this is where the normal optical parameters like refractive index, absorption coefficient, they all, what we measure, what we see, are basically the effect of a linear interaction of light with matter. I will come to that in a moment, what exactly I mean by linear. But today the topic of this talk is nonlinear interaction. So light can interact with matter in a nonlinear way, and this gives rise to very many interesting results. So interesting phenomena, in fact. So for example, the color of a light beam can be changed by nonlinear optical effects. It can be continuously varied. For example, if you start with a violet beam of light, then by using optical parametric generation, which is one of the optical nonlinearities, you can change the color of that violet beam continuously from violet up to the infrared. So these kind of things are possible in nonlinear optics. So initially, we will look a little bit on the theory of nonlinear optics. Only the most essential part will be shown here. After that, we will go into some of the experimental results and things like that. So to begin with, let us note that we can divide nonlinear interactions into parametric and non-parametric nonlinearities when we look down into the level of molecules and atoms. So what are parametric nonlinearities? These are nonlinearities in which case the initial and final quantum states of a system are same. So that means if light is interacting with matter, with a molecule, then there is no real excitation in the molecule from one real state to another state. The electron, all these excitations are by electrons. The electron does not go to another real state, but the electron gets perturbed. So there is a perturbation on the electron. It oscillates. Though it doesn't go to another orbital or another quantum state, it oscillates. And that oscillation, if it is unharmonic, that is a nonlinear oscillation, and that gives rise to a nonlinearity. So parametric nonlinearities are those where the electron does not really go into another allowed quantum state. And the corresponding susceptibility will be a real susceptibility. What I mean is it won't be a complex one, because a complex susceptibility will have an absorption part and all. We will see that a bit later. Okay, so to understand what this is, let us look at a dielectric and let's see what is the induced dipole moment, the electrical dipole moment in a dielectric. So as an example, I take the oxygen molecule. So this is the normal oxygen molecule with two oxygen atoms. So these are the oxygen nuclei, and then the electrons are shared in a covalent bond like this. So in the normal case, the center of the positive charge, we know that if these two are the positive charges, the nuclei, the center has to be here. That center coincides with the center, the geometric center of the negative charge, because the negative charge is the electron cloud around here. However, when you apply an electric field to this dielectric molecule, what happens is that if this is the field direction, then the electrons will move a little bit to one side and the nucleus will move a little bit towards the other side because of the electrical attraction. So now the centers of the negative and positive charges, they have separated, and once they have separated like this, it has become an electric dipole. So this is very similar to a magnetic dipole. We know that when the north of a bar magnet is separate from the south of the bar magnet, that is a magnet. So very similar to that, here you have an induced electrical dipole. Now, minus Ex, where x is the distance between these two centers and E is the electronic charge, that gives us the dipole moment. Now we can think about a large number of similar molecules. If you take unit volume, then there will be n. That's n is the number density, which means the number of molecules per unit volume. So if you take unit volume, that is 1 cc, 1 centimeter cube of oxygen molecules, then you can multiply each of them have become a dipole. So you can multiply mu with n, so that will give you a quantity called capital P. It's a vector because the dipole has a direction. So this vector capital P is known as the electric polarization. Now P can be written in the form n mu. It can also be written in the form P is equal to epsilon naught chi1 E. So this is very important. This equation and the equation that follows are very important in nonlinear optics. So this is the induced electric polarization. This is the applied electric field. Epsilon naught is the dielectric constant for vacuum, and chi1 is a quantity called the susceptibility. Because in this case, P is directly proportional to E, very similar to the Hooke's law, F is equal to minus kx. So like that, this is also a linear relationship. So we say this is the regime of, this is a linear interaction because there is no E square, E cube, anything here. And in a more general case, if you apply an electric field in this direction, it is not absolutely necessary that the dipole, induced dipole, also aligns in the same direction. There are situations where the induced dipole moment aligns in a slightly different direction. So when that happens, we have to write this expression in the form of tensors. It has to be a tensor equation. So we will write mu I is equal to alpha ij ej, where alpha ij is the molecular polarizability tensor. So this is like, instead of P, if we had written mu, normally we would have written mu is equal to epsilon naught. Then instead of chi1, we will write a hyperpolarizability, then E. So instead of that, we write here mu I is alpha ij ej. This is important. This is what we have to look for. Sorry. This is a tensor, alpha ij. I'm not really going much into that at the moment, except to say that you use a tensor quantity like this when you want to connect two quantities which are in different directions. So mu I is in the I direction, ej is in the j direction. Now, what we saw just now is the case of applying a DC electric field to the molecule. Now think about applying an electromagnetic radiation field to this molecule. So that's what normally happens in every optical experiment, or even when sunlight falls on matter, this is exactly what happens. The electromagnetic radiation is falling on matter. So what is the way, in which way does matter interact with the incoming electromagnetic radiation? In the normal case, this is always by means of the electrons. An electron excitation can happen, and it can also be, when you think about a molecule, this can be a molecular vibration. It can also be a rotation. So those who have studied spectroscopy, they know that there are three kinds of excitations possible for a molecule. These are the rotational excitation of the molecule, vibrational excitation of the molecule, and electronic excitation of the molecule. So here we are considering the electronic excitation of the molecule. We know that the electromagnetic field is an extremely fast oscillating field. So we usually talk in terms of the wavelength. Like we say that 400 to 700 nanometers. So that is the wavelength range for the visible optical spectrum. Now, if you calculate the corresponding frequency, then we can see that this is an extremely high frequency. It will go up to 10 to the power of 14 hertz. So like, 5 into 10 to the power of 14 hertz. So that's a 10 to the power 14 is a very, very large number. So that is the frequency at which the electromagnetic radiation field is oscillating. So that's why we show here a sine wave, and the electron, because we are talking about electron oscillations, the electron in your molecule also will oscillate at the same frequency. So this is what we consider as the Lorentz atom model, the classical harmonic oscillator. electron on a spring picture. So in the linear regime, the electron oscillates like a simple harmonic oscillator. So we can write the corresponding force equation for the simple harmonic oscillator. So force is equal to minus m omega naught square x, where x is the extension from the equilibrium position and omega naught is the frequency of oscillation and m is the mass. So this equation has a direct relevance to the polarization equation we just saw. P is equal to epsilon naught chi1 E. So in the same way, like P is linearly related to E here the force is linearly related to the extension. So you can remember that this is the same expression for a simple harmonic oscillator, a simple pendulum, and all that. Now consider a nonlinear restoring force. So when we start thinking about a nonlinear restoring force, we have to write extra terms in addition to this linear term. So we will write, in addition to the first term, minus max square minus mbx cube, like that. So now you have an x square term and you also have an x cube term. Now you will see that this kind of a force, a nonlinear restoring force acting upon a nonlinear force acting upon the molecule or acting upon the electron, gives rise to a nonlinear electrical polarization which has terms in addition to the linear term. This is the linear term we have already seen. In addition to that, chi2 e square plus chi3 e cube, like that. So new susceptibilities start appearing. Chi1 is the linear electrical susceptibility, chi2 is the second order nonlinear susceptibility, and chi3 is the third order nonlinear susceptibility. So once we have written the force like this, we can write the corresponding potential, and we know that the potential Vx is given by minus F dot dr, and so this will be, you have to integrate. Then we get half m omega naught square x square plus 1 by 3 ma x cube plus 1 by 4 mb x to the power 4, like that. So this is the electric potential field in which the electron is going to oscillate. Now we can infer a few things from the electric potential which is given by this expression. The first thing is, in this potential, the first term is an x square term. That corresponds to the linear term here in force is an x. Because of the integration, the x has become x square. And the next term is an x cube term. And then the next term is an x to the power 4 term. So from this, it is very obvious that x square is an even function, x to the power 4 is an even function, but x cube is not an even function. Similarly, x to the power 5 also is not an even function. So what it means is, if you take only the first term, Vx is equal to half m omega 0 square x square, we all know that that is the potential for a simple harmonic oscillator. And you will see the symmetric potential given in black lines here. So this potential, which is a symmetric potential because of the x square term, is the potential for a simple harmonic oscillator. But if you look at x cube, this has to be asymmetric. The reason is that when x is positive, x cube is a positive number, but when x is negative, it is a negative number. So the values are not the same on the right axis and the left axis. So in the next slide, we will see this a little more clearly. Okay, the slide after this. So we are talking about oscillating electrons. So are there some examples? Of course, there are lots of examples. Almost every material is an example. But just for the sake of understanding, here I'm showing a conjugated molecule. So what are conjugated molecules? In conjugated molecules, we have single bonds and double bonds alternating like this. So this is an acetylene molecule. It's a very simple molecule. That's why we have taken this molecule. Now let us look at the potential well of the acetylene molecule. So the electron potential well. So we all know that the potential in which the electron moves is the potential of the nucleus. Now there are three different kinds of electrons. So let us take the acetylene molecule being like this. You can see the carbon backbone here, and carbon has three different, it has the 1s state, 2s state, and also the 2p state. The 1s state is the first shell of the, if I can use the old classical model of the atom, then we say that's the first shell. Let's say 1s is the very first orbital of the carbon atom, and that is a little down here in the potential well, because this is the orbital which is closest to the nucleus. So it's not really easy to do anything to the electrons which are in the 1s orbital. They are very firmly bound to the nucleus. So now those electrons in the 2s orbital, these are known as sigma electrons. So the sigma shell electron states, and they can form bonds with the nearby atoms and all that. And if you go to the 2p state, those are the pi electrons, so-called pi electrons. Now the interesting thing about pi electrons is that being far away from the nucleus is down here. So these electrons are in the boundary, in the outermost region, and therefore they are a little free to move around. Even though they cannot really leave the nucleus, they can easily form bonds with the nearby atoms more easier than the sigma electrons. And then not only that, when a bond is formed like this, because we know electrons are actually wave functions. So even though our description is almost completely classical in this talk, we have to remember that they are not exactly point particles. They are wave functions. They extend over space. So the pi electrons actually extend over space like this, like a cloud, and you can see the electron anywhere in this cloud. You can calculate a probability, of course, but in principle, they can be anywhere in this region, anywhere in space. So this freedom actually allows them to move quickly when there is an external electromagnetic field. We know electromagnetic field is nothing but the electric field and the magnetic field oscillating perpendicular to each other. So that's why this kind of a system with pi electrons are very good for nonlinear optics, because in nonlinear optics what we need is freedom for electron to move around quite a bit. That is when the oscillations become unharmonic. Like the electron down here in the 1s orbital, if at all it oscillates, it may not oscillate, but if at all it oscillates, that will be a linear oscillation only. But in the same conditions, the pi electrons can oscillate non-linearly. So this is what leads to nonlinear optical effects. Now again, coming back to the symmetric potential. So this is the potential that we wrote down. Vx is x square plus x cube plus x to the power 4. Now I'm showing two kinds of potentials. So this is a centrosymmetric medium. You can see it's a parabola. This is the potential for a linear harmonic oscillator. And this medium has to be centrosymmetric. The reason is that only in a centrosymmetric medium, what I mean by that is that there is a center of symmetry for this medium. Oxygen, for example, has a center of symmetry, oxygen molecule. So in such a system, what will happen is that this term has to be zero. Because since the potential is symmetric, it cannot have x cube term in this. It can have x square term, then you get a potential like this. It can have x square plus x to the power 4, then you get a potential like this. Obviously, this potential is not a parabola, but it is symmetric. So this symmetric but non-parabolic potential is what gives you third order nonlinearities, because this term corresponds to third order optical nonlinearities. This one will not give you any nonlinearity because it's a plain simple parabola. So what we need to understand is that centrosymmetric materials will show only odd order. Odd order, what I mean by is this, first one, third one, like that. They are the odd order nonlinearities. And if you want a second order nonlinearity to happen, there are a lot of applications for second order nonlinearities. In fact, more applications are there for second order nonlinear materials compared to third order nonlinear. Of course, I mean, they're both, but frequency conversion and all that is almost always done by second order nonlinearity. So therefore, we need materials without a center of symmetry. Only then can we have second order nonlinearities. And we know what kind of materials do not have a center of symmetry. For that, we need order in the system. If a system is ordered, if the molecules are aligned or something like that, then that will lose a center of symmetry, because an order means a preference in a particular direction. When there is a preference in a particular direction, the material becomes anisotropic, and anisotropy means breaking of symmetry. So we know anisotropic materials in nature, they are crystals. This is the reason why for second order nonlinearity to happen, we need crystals. You will see that second harmonic generation, optical parametric generation, some frequency generation, all those things which are second order nonlinearities, we have to use crystals for getting that kind of nonlinearity. So this is the picture for an anisotropic crystal. So the potential is like Vx is the first linear term plus the x cube term, which causes this asymmetry in the potential. Okay, so now coming to the order of magnitudes of these nonlinearities. So what is the value of chi2, chi3 and all that? This is important. So in condensed matter, usually chi1 is of the order of unity. It's about 1 ESU in fact. Chi2 is very small. You can see that it's in the order of 10 to the power minus 8 ESU, and Chi3 is even smaller, 10 to the power minus 15 ESU. So what this tells us is that though we can easily theorize about anharmonic oscillations and all that, the real oscillation you have in a material system is very, very small. The anharmonic part is very, very small compared to the harmonic part. So one natural question that arises then is, then why do we worry about all this if this is so small? Does it really give any effects? I mean, maybe there are no effects, so there is not much interest in studying these kind of things. This is not really true, because it is seen that when you apply high intensities, the nonlinearity will easily come out of a material. So this is very important. We have to apply high intensities. Lot of force, lot of optical force needs to be put into our material if we want to see the nonlinear behavior of that material. So how do we apply a lot of force optically? There is only one way of doing it. We need laser beams for that. So this is the reason why when we do nonlinear optical experiments, almost always we have to use laser beams for getting our results. So just to give you a parallel from electronics, so this is a fundamental frequency. Let's say you have an oscillator, an electronic oscillator. So this is the fundamental frequency. If you add the second harmonic to it, for some reason, it can happen because of distortion. This is called harmonic distortion, particularly in amplifiers and oscillators. You are trying to generate one frequency like this, but in that process, sometimes, depending on your configuration and all that, the second harmonic also can be there. Now, if you add the fundamental with the second harmonic, this is what you get. So obviously, you see that there is no symmetry between the upper part and the lower part. So thinking backwards, this means if this is the kind of response the electron has, this asymmetric response, that gives rise to the second harmonic in your system. Now look at the fundamental and third harmonic going together. Now if you add these two, you can see that you have that symmetry again. This is symmetric. Both sides are symmetric. Only thing is they are not harmonic because of this bend here. So you can think back, and again you will come to the conclusion that this kind of a behavior by the electron in light matter interaction can give rise to the third harmonic of the fundamental light that you put into your system. So there are examples of parametric nonlinear optical phenomena. There are many of them, and this is what we call the constitutive relation. Nonlinear polarization depends on E square, E cube, like that. This is in the tensor form. That's why they are written separately. And chi ij1 gives rise to linear refraction and absorption. This is the linear regime. Chi 2 ijk, some frequency generation, difference frequency generation, rectification, electro-optic effect. So you can see if there are two frequencies, omega 1 and omega 2, they get added up, omega 1 plus omega 2. It's also possible that omega 1 minus omega 2, that is difference frequency generation. Now this is something called Pockels effect, omega plus 0. In the third order, we have third harmonic generation, nonlinear refraction and nonlinear absorption, four-wave mixing. So three waves mixed together to produce a fourth wave. Here, actually, this is a three-wave mixing process where two waves mix together and form a third wave. Then the third wave also get mixed with the other two waves. And similar to the Pockels effect, there is something called Kerr effect, which is a third order phenomenon. So these are some of the examples of parametric nonlinear optical phenomena in the second and third order with applications. So in today's talk, actually, I will be concentrating more on nonlinear absorption because that's an area in which we have worked quite a lot. So nonlinear refraction and nonlinear absorption of the third order. So in the third order, nonlinear refraction actually leads to an effect called self-focusing. So if you start with a laser beam of a Gaussian spatial profile. So what's a Gaussian spatial profile? If your laser beam has maximum intensity at its center and the intensity decreases towards the edges, then that is called a Gaussian. All those beams are not Gaussian, so the intensity has to fit to a Gaussian profile, and in many cases we see that this actually fits. In a number of lasers, the output intensity is actually Gaussian because this is nothing but what we call the TEM00 mode in an electromagnetic cavity. You must have studied, the master students must have studied the cavity modes when they do electromagnetic theory. So the TEM00, TEM01, TEM10, so there are many modes. So this is the TEM00 mode in a cavity. So if you start with that kind of a laser beam, then the third order refraction, that is nonlinear third order refraction, will result in the beam getting focused by itself. This is known as self-focusing. So this is a medium which has a third order nonlinearity. Similar to that, there is also another interesting effect in the absorptive part. The third order nonlinear absorption actually gives rise to an effect called two-photon absorption. So we all know that if there are two energy states, say E1 and E2, and if you want to send an electron from E1 to E2, then the frequency of the electron should match the energy difference. So if nu is the frequency of the photon, if nu is the frequency of the photon, then h nu is its energy, and h nu should match this energy gap. That's the situation when an absorption takes place. This is the normal knowledge. But then when you come to the nonlinear optical regime, there are possibilities, there are other possibilities. So one possibility is that if you take a photon of half the energy, so you don't really need to take full nu. Let's say I'm taking a photon of half nu, then if you put a lot of intensity, so this theme always comes in nonlinear optics. You need a laser beam. A laser beam has large number of photons packed together. That's why it's very intense. So if you put an intense laser beam, where photons are very packed together, the intensity is high, but the photon energy is only half. Even in that case, an absorption will take place. So this absorption, which happens through virtual energy states, is known as two-photon absorption. So, for example, if this energy gap can be bridged by one photon of 266 nanometer, it can happen by using 2 photons of 532 nanometer. The reason why I write 532 here is because 532 nanometer is the second harmonic output of the very common Nd:YAG laser. In many laser labs, this wavelength is available. So self-focusing and nonlinear two-photon absorption are just two of the effects of parametric nonlinearity in a system. Okay, now we come to non-parametric nonlinearities. Many of our studies are actually in non-parametric nonlinearities. The reason for that is that parametric nonlinearities are relatively weak to measure, but non-parametric nonlinearities are much easier to measure in a laboratory. And also many materials are available in which we can see non-parametric nonlinearities. So these are those nonlinearities where the initial and final quantum states of your molecule or whatever material you are working with, they are different. So a real transition has taken place from one energy state to another energy state. And that kind of transitions naturally are characterized by a complex susceptibility. So some of the quasi third order processes are here. Absorption saturation. So this is known as saturable absorption. Can happen due to many reasons. So in semiconductors, for instance, band filling, polyblocking. So some of these things can happen, and because of which a material can gradually become more and more transparent when you apply more and more light into it. That is what is meant by absorption saturation. You put more light into it, it becomes more transparent. Now, similar to that, there is another thing called excited state absorption, free carrier absorption, and all that. So here what happens is, when you apply light into the system, the molecules get excited to higher energy states, but then those energy states start absorbing. So they also start absorbing. So that is what we call by the name excited state absorption. So this is common in molecules, organic molecules, polymers, and all that. And free carrier absorption is in the case of semiconductors and metals. So there also this is quite possible. Then there are effects like thermal scattering, which are because of the heating effect of the laser radiation in a system. So now we will look at optical nonlinearity in typical materials. Coming to organics and polymers. So as we have seen before, delocalization of pi electrons. In acetylene molecule, we saw that the pi electrons can move around a bit and they are very free. The technical term for this is delocalization. Then that's a parametric process. Then excited state absorption, which is actually a non-parametric process. So these two can contribute to nonlinearities in organics and polymers. And small metal spheres are very interesting. Metal nanoparticles, a lot of people work with metal nanoparticles. So in metal nanoparticles, we have four kind of transitions basically. So there are intraband transitions, interband transitions, hot electrons, and excitation of the surface plasmon resonances if you are in metals, particularly noble metals. So intraband transitions are those are dipolar oscillations of confined free electrons within the conduction band. So we know that in the case of a metal, the conduction band has many electrons there, and they are confined actually, so they can oscillate when there is electromagnetic radiation around. These free but bound electrons, they can oscillate, and they will have some chi3 because of that, of the order of 10 to the power 10 ESU for a gold nanoparticle of 5 nanometer diameter. But this will vanish for large particles, because when you come to large particles, the valence band, conduction band, they will all get mixed up, and therefore this kind of the bound electron picture becomes a bit blurred in the case of the metal lattice. So therefore, this doesn't exist for large particles or for bulk metal. Now, the other type is interband transitions. So these are the D band to SP band transitions. Again, all this we are talking for nanoparticles. That's very important. Because if you talk about metal, the bulk metal, then these bands also will be mixed up. So here, there can be absorption saturation because of polyblocking, and the chi3 here is of the order of 10 to the power minus 8 ESU. This is actually the imaginary part of chi3, which corresponds to absorption or amplification. And then there are what we call hot electrons. So these hot electrons can be generated in metal nanoparticles by the application of very intense optical fields, and they can also be generated by the non-radiative decay of the surface plasmon resonances. So the corresponding chi3 will be about 10 to the power minus 7 ESU, is one order higher than the interband transitions. Then surface plasmon resonances are a very different kind of, very unique for metal nanoparticles. So these are the collective oscillation of the electrons on the surface of the nanoparticle, and they can also contribute to the optical nonlinearity of the nanoparticle. Then we have semiconductors. Semiconductor quantum dots are there. So they have, quantum confinement effects. So there are excitons there. So all those will contribute to the nonlinear optical behavior of the system. Then we also have a rich host of nanocomposites. So in the case of organic molecules, we have already seen in the case of acetylene how the pi electron cloud here makes it possible to have a parametric nonlinearity. Now coming to polymers. Now polymers are nothing but organic molecules arranged in the form of a chain and all that. So sometimes some of these can actually mimic the behavior of metals, because it is easy to see that the pi electrons, because they can move around like this, if there's a long chain, then this can behave like a metallic lattice. So in the case of the movement of the electrons. So we can even talk about an electron cloud in the case of very long polymers. Not like a metal, of course, but in some sense. So that's why we can think about a valence band, a conduction band, the separation, small separation here, and all that. So these polymers, because of the freedom for the electrons to move like this, are very good for nonlinear optics. In fact, people have done calculations. So this picture is to show how the second hyperpolarizability increases with the number of monomers in a polymer chain. Now, what is second hyperpolarizability? second hyperpolarizability is nothing but chi3 divided by the number density. You have to multiply by the Lorentz field factor in the denominator. So basically, the third order susceptibility for just one molecule. That is what we call second hyperpolarizability. So this has been calculated, and calculation shows for a polymer chain of length L, gamma value is given by this. So the important quantities here are the number of electrons per unit length, electronic charge, the Bohr radius, and all that. 1974 itself, this calculation was done, and later people measured this quantity, the hyperpolarizability, in real polymers, and they found a relationship. They found a behavior which is similar to predicted by this expression. And of course, it doesn't increase indefinitely. It cannot. The nonlinearity cannot increase indefinitely. So somewhere along the line, it starts saturating like this. So after something like 10 monomer units and all that. And electronic states in materials. When we think about NLO, it's important to understand this. So for the insulator, there is a very clear band gap between the valence band and the conduction band. And for the semiconductor, this is a fill band, valence band and conduction band, they are close to each other. And for the conductor, these are actually mixed up. Valence band and conduction band, they overlap. And electron energies in bulk metals. So how are the electrons distributed in different energy states in a bulk metal, for example? So we know that bulk metals are different from molecules, for instance. In a molecule, you have a certain number of atoms in the molecule, and each molecule is separate. They have kind of arrangement, but they are separate. But in the case of a metallic lattice, there are millions and millions of metal atoms staying close to each other. So this is what gives rise to the electron cloud around the nuclei there. So the atomics, it can be understood from this picture. So the atomic separation in, let's say, in bulk metal, the atomic separation is very, very small. They are very close to each other. So that's why in this particular case, the 2s and 2p states, they have become very broad. So you can see that the 2s state has become broad like this, and 2p state has become very broad like this. So because of the interaction of the orbitals, and then this is a common region here like this. However, imagine separating these metal atoms from each other. If you take them away from each other, or if you can think about a single metal atom, which is quite possible in the case of nanotechnology. It may not, I don't know whether anybody has isolated one atom completely, but it is very much possible nowadays to make very stable configurations of AU8 and all that. Just 8 atoms of gold sitting together as one nanocluster. So these are actually known as nanoclusters because they are even smaller than nanoparticles. So in such a case, we will see an example later, so I'm not really going much into that now, except to say that these energy levels will clearly separate. However, in the case of, as we know, in the case of a bulk metal, this is the way the electrons are distributed over the various energy states. So this is called the Fermi-Dirac distribution. And we have the Fermi energy somewhere in the middle here. And this is the expression for Fermi-Dirac statistics and all that. So this is what basically governs the electron energies in bulk metals. And coming to the electronic transitions in metal nanoparticles, as I told you earlier, there are 3 kinds of transitions in metal nanoparticles. So the D band is here, the SP band is here, they are a little bit separate. There is the Fermi level in between, conduction band extends all the way here, and intraband excitation, surface plasmon, radiative decay of the surface plasma, non-radiative decay also is there. So all these things happen in metal nanoparticles. So because of this, metal nanoparticles are very interesting media. Now, looking at the nonlinear absorption in various systems, so this is what I told you about excited state absorption. This is a ground state, this is an excited state. So the electron gets excited from the ground to the first excited state, but from here, again, there is an excitation. These kind of materials are known as reverse saturable absorbers. In general, there is one condition though, this excitation has to be stronger than this excitation. Then they are reverse saturable absorbers. If the opposite is the case, then they are saturable absorbers. So we have propagation equations and all that, which govern the propagation of light through these kind of materials. And in organic molecules, we usually talk about a 5-level system whenever we have to consider nonlinearities in them, nonlinear absorption in them. So here there's a ground state, there is one excited state, a singlet excited state, which we call S1, and then S2 up here. Then there is also the triplet levels T1 and T2. So we have the singlet system as well as the triplet system in organic molecules. So we have to consider both of them. And we have something called rate equation analysis. If you want to go in more detail to study the real processes happening in excited molecules. So very similar to the Einstein's rate equations. Here we write dN1 by dt, dN2 by dt like that, where N1 is the population here, N2 is the population here. And then this set of coupled differential equations can be solved together by formalisms like the Runge-Kutta formalism. And then from that, we can find out values of the excited state, cross-section, absorption cross-sections and all that. Anyway, coming to some practical applications of nonlinear absorbers, which are basically saturable absorbers and reverse saturable absorbers. So I give the name optical limiters or reverse saturable absorbers. So here, what happens is there is an incoming light field, a laser beam is coming, and there is a material here, which is, let us say, optical limiting material. Then the transmitted light is less intense compared to the incoming light. So when the incoming light intensity increases, the transmitted light becomes sort of constant. So that is the example of an optical limiter. So look at this graph. There is some incident intensity here. There is a transmitted intensity here. And the normal behavior for a material which does not show any nonlinearity is to increase linearly. So as you increase the incident intensity here, the output also should increase accordingly. So that's a linear behavior. However, in the case of an optical limiter, instead of increasing like that, this will kind of saturate, and it will go to a kind of an asymptotic value here, and beyond that it will not increase. So the transmitted intensity comes to a kind of a constant. So this kind of a behavior is called an optical limiting behavior. So there are a lot of applications for this. Like one of the earlier news articles, which actually appeared in 2016, is about airplane pilots who face laser attacks. What is a laser attack, basically? So you can see a laser beam going like this. If any of you have ever tried a small laser beam into the sky in the night, and if you look from a distance, if you see that from a distance, you can see that this is the way the beam is going to expand. The beam will expand like that. Don't try this. I think it's very illegal to do this. A secret which I can share with you is that when I was a PhD student, we actually did this. Not me, I mean my seniors actually did this in Cochin University laser lab, and the beam went out of the window into the sky. And seeing that, two policemen actually came to the university to investigate what is going on. So they almost caught my senior PhD students, but they switched off the laser by the time, and the policeman could not really find from where it came. So this is not really legal as far as I understand. Anyway, people play with laser beams, unfortunately, because you can buy little small lasers for as low as maybe 200 rupees or something, and you can buy from Amazon. Actually, I bought one for my son's school project, and just 300 rupees, and I was amazed at the power of the beam. It's very powerful, and it can certainly damage our eyes. So one needs to be very careful with these little small laser beams. So people have a tendency, particularly for some reason near Birmingham, they send these laser beams onto airplanes. And in a couple of cases, what happened was the beam actually fell into the eyes of the pilots. Who there are two pilots, fortunately, for all planes. It fell into the eyes of at least one of the pilots. And if that happens, laser beam is not certainly a comfortable thing to fall into your eyes. I mean, it has the power to kill. If at short distance, it can damage the eyes. I have at least two friends who have lost their one eye each because of laser beams. So this is not something that you can play around with. Fortunately, in both these cases, whenever somebody is sending a laser beam from far away, the beam spreads a bit. And because of that spreading, the pilots did not lose their eyesight or anything. But once this happens, the itching and the after effects can stay for some time. In some cases, I know cases where for 2 to 3 days, watering of the eyes and uncomfortable and all that can happen. So same thing happened to the pilots, and it's a rule in the airline industry that both pilots have to be in perfect good health to fly a plane. So if one of them has a problem like this, eyesight issues, because once laser beam falls into your eye, you cannot really see anything properly for a while. That is very dangerous. So the planes had to be grounded. The planes had to come back to the runway, and you can imagine the kind of difficulties and inconveniences this can cause. Now, optical limiters are potential solutions to these kind of issues, because the advantage of a limiter is that normally it can allow a lot of light to pass through. It becomes opaque only when the intensity is high. So I can have a goggle which is made of, I can have spectacles which are made of optical limiters, and I will be able to see everything normally. However, if there is a laser beam falling onto my eye, somebody send a laser beam to me, it will suddenly become opaque. So this is the ideal case of the optical limiter, which will protect you completely, protect your eyes at least, from any kind of laser attack. But this ideal situation has not been achieved yet. People have tried a lot. Different materials have been tried for optical limiting: carbon nanotubes, fullerenes, phthalocyanins, porphyrins, many others, organic, inorganic, composites, everything have been tried. But there are many different conditions to be satisfied at the same time. So therefore, it's not very easy to make an optical limiter which will work under all the predictable conditions. So the US Army, for instance, spent quite a bit of money to make the ideal optical limiter, but it's not very clear whether they have succeeded yet. Even if they have succeeded, it will not appear in any journals, because these kind of research normally doesn't get published. So what we publish normally are those researches funded by universities, governments, and in the non-secret mode. That's the kind of research which gets published in journals. So to know whether something is an optical limiter or is it a saturable absorber, which is the opposite behavior, we have to measure the nonlinear transmission through that. And in olden days, there was this type of measurement called input-output measurement. So what you look for is, we know that there is a law called the Beer-Lambert law. That is what is followed by materials in the linear regime. So you look for deviations from that Beer-Lambert law. If there are deviations, then you know that there is a nonlinear behavior. So the modified Beer-Lambert law goes like this: I by I naught is equal to e to the power minus alpha plus beta ix. So here alpha is the linear absorption coefficient and beta is the third order nonlinear absorption coefficient. So this is the equation which is used for fitting many of the optical limiter experiments if you do an input-output measurement. However, by 1990, another kind of experiment called open aperture C-scan became very popular. So the advantage here is that you can set it up very easily. So there is a laser beam here, and there are some detectors, one detector here and one here, and there is a lens here. So you have to focus the beam through the lens, and then on the other side you can detect the transmitted light because you have a sample here, and you move your sample in this region. That is the most important part. The reason why you move is for changing the light intensity seen by your sample. So it's very obvious that if you keep your sample at the focus, then the sample sees maximum intensity, but if you move it away from the focus, then the sample does not see as much intensity. So in principle, you can move the sample from here to here. That will give you the information that you need. The information that you are looking for in this experiment is how much the sample transmits when the intensity falling on it changes. So that is the information given to us by the C-scan experiment. And there is a translation stage here to move the sample, and there are controllers. And usually in our lab, for instance, the experiment is automated because otherwise it will take a lot of time to make this measurement. Little by little you have to move and measure the transmission. So if you automate the experiment, it's much faster. So, and there are transmission equations like this which you use to finally fit your data. And from that fitting, this is the algorithm for numerical calculations. And from that fitting, you will be able to find out, to calculate the nonlinear absorption coefficient and also the saturation intensity coefficient. So very interesting kind of C-scan curves. This is a C-scan curve, an interesting kind of curve because this is different from what was originally published in 1990 by the same people it was from Creole. It was from this department where people invented the C-scan technique. And I think, can I take 10 minutes more? My 1 hour is up.
So the next speaker is waiting, sir.
Okay. Oh, sorry. Okay, in that case, I think I'll 5 minutes. Is it okay? Just to wind this up?
Yes, sir. Okay.
Just 5 minutes. And because I started only at 3:15, so because of technical issues, and so I'll finish very fast.
Okay.
So So gold nanoparticles of different sizes we investigated. So what we did was so this is the paper that appeared later in Nanoletters, Evolution of Nonlinear Optical Properties from Gold Atomic Clusters to Plasmonic Nanocrystals. So basically we tried different sizes of gold nanoparticles, and when you go to very small gold clusters, you can see that they start behaving like molecules actually. Unfortunately, I cannot go into any of the details now. And we compared the behavior of plasmonic nanoparticles of 4 nanometer size. And we measured the C-scans. So the C-scans, what we found out from these C-scans is that when you go for slightly higher, slightly larger nanoparticles like 4 nanometer nanoparticles, then you have a mixed behavior of saturable absorption and optical limiting. But when you go for the very smallest, I mean, the smallest we worked was 25 atoms of gold, that cluster, and that gives you a perfect optical limiter behavior. So the conclusion is that by changing the size of your nanoparticle, you can get very different kind of behavior at the output. So this was our conclusion from those measurements, and so we calculated all the nonlinear parameters and everything. I think I should rather stop here because of paucity of time. I'll just go to the very last slide. So just an example of how we many of these materials we tried, we measured in our lab in RRI, and this is one of the papers. In this paper, we actually had to give the referee asked for a table of whatever we studied, and some of our studies are listed here. There are many parameters, and basically this quantity is calculated beta, the nonlinear absorption coefficient. So I'm stopping here. So thank you so much for attending this talk, and sorry for taking a little longer time than what was given to me. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. It was such an informative session. Now I invite Dr. Srikala Ji for the formal vote of thanks.
Good afternoon, everyone. Today was really a day of learning. I am really glad to deliver vote of thanks to this section. On behalf of Department of Physics, St. Joseph's College for Women, I take this opportunity to thank Dr. Reggie Phillips, sir, who is a great inspiration for all of us through his scientific journey. It's a personal delight for me that I got opportunity to interact with his research students. Their successful career itself be a proof of the quality of scientific works handled by Dr. Reggie Phillips, sir. Sir, your today's talk about nonlinear optics in the nano domain was really interesting and informative. Once again, thank you so much, sir, for your valuable presence. I would like to extend my gratitude to all the participants who show keen interest throughout the talk. Thank you all. Thank you so much.